Okay, so the bad news is that you chose to join a week in the Torah where there's a double portion, very difficult portion, very technical, no plot, and very ritualistic. So if you want to sign off now, you could. No, I'm kidding. So it just makes it a little harder for us to dig deeper and see what is the inner meaning, because a lot of these laws don't apply today, as we will discuss. It's the portion, it's a double portion, Tazri Mitzora, which is the purification. The impurity of the tzara'at, which is a form of a skin ailment, and then the purification follows in the next parsha. So we'll discuss that at great length, hopefully, and hopefully we'll be able to make it meaningful and exciting and relevant. But to begin, we begin as usual with the parsha in a nutshell, so at least you know what you're getting into, so there's no false advertising here. Tazri Mitzora in a nutshell. So the Parshas of Tajiri and Mitzora continue the discussion of the laws of Tuma and Tahara, which is ritual impurity and purity. So it begins with a woman. In other words, the name of the Parsha Tazria is a woman who will give seed. Tazria, zera, is seed. It could be a child. It could be even planting vegetation. But in any case, so a woman giving birth should undergo a process of purification, which includes immersion in a mikvah, a naturally gathered pool of water, and bringing offerings to the holy temple. All male infants are to be circumcised on the 8th day. So that's the beginning of the parsha, but the bulk of the parsha is what we're about to read. Tsarat, often mistranslated as leprosy, is a supernatural plague which can afflict people as well as garments or homes. And sorry for getting technical here, but this is a little bit what the Torah gets into great detail. Here you have it in the nutshell. If white or pink patches appear on a person's skin, dark pink or dark green in garments or homes, a Kohen is summoned, judging by various signs, such as increase in size of the afflicted area after a 7-day quarantine. The Kohen pronounces its tameh impure or tahor pure. So in other words, the Torah goes into great detail talking about the various shades of the colorings which are impure and the signs of impurity and the signs of purity, but you need the Kohen to come and announce the person pure or impure. A person afflicted with tzara'at must dwell alone outside the camp or city until he is healed. Not only alone outside the camp, but also alone separate from other people with tzara'at, which is unusual because there are other forms of purity, even other forms of impurity which are more severe, yet there's no obligation to sit alone. But in any case, so we continue, the afflicted area in a garment or home must be removed. If the tzara'at reoccurs, the entire garment or home must be destroyed. So that's generally the first portion. Then we go to the second portion. Mitzora, when the leper heals, he or she is purified by the Kohen with a special procedure involving 2 birds, spring water in an earthen vessel, a piece of cedar wood, a scarlet thread, and a bundle of hyssop. Of course, all of this has significance. We just have to figure out what that is. So hopefully we can dwell into that as well. Which ritual impurity is also engendered through a seminal or other discharge in a man, a menstruation or other discharge of blood in a woman, necessitating purification through immersion in a mikvah. So this is, again, 2 portions, very long and very detailed, hard to read in the sense that they're just long and technical. So now the question becomes, what do we do with this parsha, and what does it mean to us, and where do we go from here? So the first thing is to think about the placement of the middle of the book of Leviticus. That's really where we're at. So in the middle of the book of Leviticus, we have laws of purity and impurity. Last week was the purity and impurity of animals, because we discussed the kosher animals and non-kosher animals. And kosher is, I don't think kosher is even a biblical word. I think kosher, is kosher a biblical word? I don't think kosher is a biblical word. I think kosher just means, I think kosher is a word, kosher is a word from the Mishnah, but I don't think it's in the Bible. Kosher just means it's prepared. It's prepared. It's good to use. The biblical word for a kosher animal or non-kosher animal is tameh and tahor, is impure and pure. So at the end of last week, we discussed the laws of purity and impurity of animals. And now we move to the impurity and purity of people, which will appear also later throughout the book of Leviticus. So now the question becomes, what is this notion of purity and impurity? Like, first of all, what does it mean? And second of all, what's it doing at this point in the plot? Because I said there is no plot, but there has to be a reason why it's placed in the middle of the book. Some people just think, well, if you're writing a story, they say that, or even a sentence or even a paragraph, the most important part of the sentence or the paragraph is the beginning or the end. There's a debate if the beginning is more important than the end, or the end is more important than the beginning. But in any case, in the middle is where you throw in all the technical details that are not important, that are not that you have to get in there, but they're not your main point. So some people think that in the middle of the book of Leviticus, God just threw in all those details and hoping that at least the beginning of the book and the end of the book is will sell. And in the middle, you could just throw in the miscellaneous. Of course, that's not our perspective. So we have to figure out what is the laws of impurity and purity. First of all, what do they mean and what are they doing exactly at this point? So one perspective is that it's very much relevant to the story and to the plot that we read about last week and the last couple of weeks. So what's really happening here? What's happening here is the Jewish people build a temple. And when they build a temple, God dwells in their midst. And then there's some tension here because God is infinite, the human being is finite. There's some tension here. And we read about the epitome of the tension last week. What did we read? Last week we read that specifically on the day that the divine presence dwelled in the temple, the first day, the 8th day, we call it the 8th day, but it was the day of the inauguration of a temple, the 7-day inauguration period. 7-day inauguration period was complete. God dwells in the temple. There's the two sons of Aaron. And the two sons of Aaron run and they want to come close to God. And they take incense and they go into the Holy of Holies and they are killed because of the intense experience. The fire comes forth from God and consumes them. So we discussed that last week. But what we see here is that all of a sudden, when God is in the camp, now there's a problem. Now the question becomes, how close can you get to God and when could you get to God? Now comes the point of, as we mentioned last week, you have the love, you have the yearning, you have the drive to connect to God. But what about the respect? What about the boundaries? And some people would say that the whole concept of the impurity and purity in this parsha, which is primarily expressed in the fact of, could I come close to God? Could I go to the temple? Could I eat of the flesh of the sacrifices? So the impurity represents the gap. In other words, we're not always able to come close to God. We can only come close to God under certain conditions because of this tremendous gap between the finite and the infinite. So specifically in the book of Leviticus, which in some sense is the highlight of the Torah, because what happens? The divine presence dwells in the temple and people can come close to God. That's really what the third book is about, the offerings. So we discussed that offerings the word offering means, korban means come close to God. So here we have the opportunity to come close to God. So now the Torah says, yes, you can come close to God, but it has to be under certain conditions, because you can't always come, because there's this gap. There is the finite, there's the infinite, there's a bridge, and you have to respect the difference between creation and creator. And impurity represents that in certain times we're not able to connect, we're not able to come close, and that represents the recognition of the gap between creator and creation. So respecting the gap is really what happens in the book of Leviticus, specifically because we have this great revelation of the infinite light descending into the Jewish camp. So this is just sort of by way of introduction to try to think about why the laws of purity and impurity are specifically placed in the third book, specifically after the divine presence dwells within the Jewish camp. So that is introduction number one, I would say. Now we get to the idea of, okay, so now we understand why the placement. So this we discuss every year. What is the sense of, what is the idea of purity and impurity? And again, the laws of purity and impurity are classified as a chok, as a decree. They're the parts of the Torah that don't have a reason. There's three categories of commandments. It's called edut, chukim, how do you want it? Which order do you want? Edut, chukim, and mishpatim. You have testimonials, you have statutes, and you have ordinances. Testimonials are mitzvot that we do to commemorate the past. For example, Passover. Why do we celebrate Passover? Because we're commemorating the miracle of the past. Then you have mitzvot like chukim, decree. Why do we do it? We don't know. We just do it because God told us to do it. And the prime example is the laws of purity and impurity. And then you have mishpatim, ordinances, the logical mitzvot, like many of the 10 commandments: honor your parents, don't steal, don't kill, don't commit adultery. Those are considered ordinances. They're logical. So the idea of purity and impurity is certainly a decree, which we would never think of these mitzvot on our own. However, we know that once they're given, we're supposed to seek to try to understand what the reason is. We just have to realize that that may not be the ultimate reason. So what is purity and impurity? And where does the purity and impurity apply? And again, if you think about it, it's strange. A woman giving birth seems to be the most spiritual thing somebody can do, the most godly thing somebody can do, because it's your person's literally creating just like God creates. And all of a sudden, after the period of birth, there's a period of impurity. So how do we have to understand this concept of purity and impurity? And different theories, but one perspective is that the idea of impurity is not necessarily a sign of something that's not good. To the contrary, if something does not, the idea of impurity is that when there is a vacuum of life, that vacuum creates impurity. And therefore, the lower forms of life do not produce impurity. The stone doesn't become impure. The tree doesn't become impure because there's not an intense form of life and holiness there to begin with. The human being, which has a soul, which has life, when the soul departs from the body, and that is what happens when a person dies, that's the most severe form of impurity. So the idea that you had a soul, life, potential, in other words, soul and life, holiness, and now there's the vacuum of that holiness, so that's the impurity, and that's the most severe form of impurity. But if you track any type of impurity, you will see that what it really is a lack of life in a place that there was life before then, because Judaism celebrates life, and coming close to God is a sign of life. The verse says, "Those who cleave to God are alive." In other words, life is a sign of godliness and holiness. So where there's the lack of life, there's the lack of holiness. And therefore, now we could start understanding that at least the cases in our parsha. When a woman gives birth, during pregnancy, the woman has additional life within her. The moment of birth is a wonderful time for the baby, certainly now he's born. For the mother, she doesn't have to carry the baby anymore. But spiritually speaking, right now, that additional life departs from the mother, departs from the person. There is a certain vacuum. And therefore, there is the idea of impurity, which means that when you're lacking the additional life, there's a period of recognition and either respecting that space and then working to refill it in some form or another. And the same thing is with the leprosy. With the leprosy, I'm just going to call it leprosy, but even though we're saying it's not natural leprosy, the sign of the leprosy is white. It's a white shade of skin. Now, when the skin turns white, now what does white represent? So the Kabbalists say, well, you have white, you're missing the blood. If the blood doesn't reach a certain area, it's going to turn white. Now, blood is the symbol of life. The Torah says many times, "Adam hu hanefesh," the soul is the blood is the soul. So again, these are examples where the potential for life and the blood is lacking. That would create the purity and impurity. That is introduction number 2. We still didn't start the parsha, but it's introduction number 2. We're about to enter introduction 3, unless anybody has any comments or questions, because these ideas here are a little bit not the common ideas here. Okay, third idea, third introduction, more specific to the concept of tzara'at, mitzora, the person with tzara'at. Why does a person get tzara'at? The Torah doesn't say. We'll open up the Parsha. You'll see the Torah is quite vague. Let's see if we can find it.
Rabbi, while you're opening it, you said that many times the Torah says that blood is what? Is
Adamu nefesh. The blood is the soul.
so.
So where there's no blood, it means the soul there's no soul there. There's no life. So where there's no life, where there was life and now there is no life, creates that vacuum. By the way, that's the reason why, according to the Kabbalah, it entered the code of law as well. But it starts in the Kabbalah that when a person wakes up in the morning, we wash our hands. Why do you wash our hands? Because when a person sleeps, the Talmud says that sleep is a 60th of death. In some sense, the conscious soul departs the body. And that's what the Talmud's expression. It's a 60th of death. And in some sense, at least the conscious mind goes back to its source. The conscious soul goes back to its source. So because there is the lack of the soul's connection to the body as it is when a person is awake, so you have that vacuum. And that vacuum creates an impurity. And therefore, in the morning, we wash away that impurity by washing the hands. So this is I'm just trying to show that it's consistent throughout various rituals within Judaism, the understanding of what the definition of impurity is. But in any case, right after the beginning, so in the beginning, we have the first portion is the portion of the impurity that happens after childbirth. Very interesting that, again, it seems strange, but once you understand the Kabbalistic meaning, everything starts making sense. After the period of giving birth to a male, there's a certain period of impurity, but the female, giving birth to a female, the period doubles. And the question becomes, how come? So after a male, there's a 7-day impurity. And after a female, it's 14 days. So how come? And so the Kabbalists would tell you that, one second, the concept of a male, so again, you have a child within yourself. Now the child leaves. Now that's additional life that was within the person. Now that life departs. So there's a vacuum. With a female, it's doubled because the female herself is a greater potential for life. So it's almost like a double measure than the male. So that's the beginning of the parsha. But then we go to chapter 13. After the 8 verses, we go to the story of the tzarat. A man has a se'et, sapachat, or baheret. These are fancy names for different forms of white skin coloring on his flesh, and it forms a lesion of tzarat on the skin of his flesh. He shall be brought to Aaron, the Kohen, or to one of his sons, the Kohanim. And then the Torah describes what happens. The Kohen shall look at the lesion on the skin of the flesh, and if the lesion has turned white, and the appearance of the lesion is deeper than the skin of his flesh, it is a lesion of tzarat. When the Kohen sees this, he shall pronounce it unclean, etc., etc., etc. It goes on and on and on, and all the various possibilities. And sometimes it has to quarantine, and the Kohen comes back in 7 days and checks, and sometimes he has to quarantine it for 2 weeks to see if it's going to grow, etc., etc. But why would a person, what does this tzarat mean? What is this? What is this form of tzarat? So the Torah itself is silent, but the sages explain that the tzarat, for whatever, they have various indicators to this, but the tzarat, say the sages, is something that a miraculous ailment that comes as a result of lashon hara, of evil speech or of slander. When a person speaks negatively about other people, then in biblical times, a possible ailment was tzarat. And of course, the point is not just punishment. The point is that by the person going through this process, having to separate from other people, a person actually would rehabilitate spiritually to the point of coming and repenting, and that repentance brings about the purity, and then that's the skin ailment would retreat, and the person could come back into the camp. So what is going on here? First of all, so where do we get this from? So the first point, we say tzarat, and the person who has tzarat is mitzora. So the word mitzora is comprised of 2 Hebrew words, which is motzira, taking out evil. In other words, slander is I am saying something bad about somebody else. That idea could have been concealed. It's hidden, but I'm advertising somebody else's negativity. So I am bringing out the other person's negativity to the surface. That's what the word mitzora means. The person who has it is mitzora. I take out evil. What does that do? That creates an affliction, but not an internal affliction, but it creates an affliction on the surface of the skin. Because in the Torah, everything is measure for measure. Whatever I create, that's what comes back to me. So if I bring out other people's negativity to the surface by speaking and engaging and speaking about it, that will also bring, as a result, in other words, God is helping me realize my mistake by having that negativity within myself rise to the surface, and then I could have it diagnosed both literally but also spiritually. I realize I have this problem, and then I can work to correct it. Now, if the idea of tzarat comes because of evil speech, now we understand many interesting details about the tzarat. So first of all, we mentioned it before, it was even in the nutshell, that while there are other forms of purity that are far more severe, that's an impurity that comes, for example, the impurity that comes from contacting a dead person. But in some sense, the impurity of tzarat is the most severe, in the sense that the person has to be alone outside the camp. And the question is, why is it so severe? Especially if you say the person, all he did is he spoke bad about somebody else. He didn't rob any bank. He didn't steal. He didn't cheat. He didn't serve idols. I mean, if you want to go and list the 613 commandments, I don't know that I would put evil speech as number one, in some sense, the worst. So why is it that the Torah gets all totally bent out of shape and says this person that speaks bad about somebody else is going to have to get this ailment and is going to have to be separated from the rest of the people and sit alone outside the camp? What's the big, why is it, what's so terrible? So he said something not nice about somebody else. Like they say in Yiddish, nish gefarlach, the world won't come to an end. There are worse sins. So the commentaries explain that what a person does when a person speaks evil about other people, what the person is doing, the person is undermining the fabric of society. The whole idea of a society is people trust each other, people love each other. If I spread evil talk, I'm literally tearing society apart. I used to think you're my friend. Then I hear in the grapevine that you did something bad against me and you said something to somebody against me. All of a sudden, I don't trust you anymore. I don't like you anymore. I pull out my investments. I don't invest in your company. And the fabric of society is going to fall apart, all through speech. And therefore, what the Torah says, to realize and to correct this, what we have to do is we have to take the person outside of society, let him see what it means to live alone, how devastating it is for a person. A person is a social creature. A person cannot live alone. It's very painful to live alone. And especially before Zoom. Now we have Zoom. We can go on for another couple of, but before the Zoom, it was very, even with the Zoom, it's hard. But before the Zoom, it was very hard to sit alone. And when a person realizes how interdependent he is with the people in society, then he realizes that how devastating slander is, and then he realizes, and hopefully will correct his negative ways, and that will lead to the healing. So that's just that is just, again, another introduction, and we'll take a question or two, and the idea of why the Torah takes the idea of speech so seriously. Go ahead, Jill.
Well, one thing, Rabbi, there was no way for them to tell the difference between actual leprosy and whatever this thing was. That's number one. So it looked very severe. And since judgment of God was involved, that's one reason they could take this very seriously. They didn't know whether it was the actual disease. And then since we have not been able to determine what was the thing that has never reappeared, it's never been identified medically since, that this did seem, I mean, what are the modern commentaries saying about the appearance of whatever this was?
Okay, so I don't, you make a lot of good points. I'm just going to address it very quickly from the traditional perspective. The commentators for about 1,000 years have been saying, make no mistake, this is not about a skin disease that they were afraid of physical contamination, and therefore the Torah discusses all these laws. They cannot be. Why can't it be? Because we know what the people knew at the time. And we know that if you have a skin disease, at least at that time, they understood you don't put the skin disease in a cold, dry place, in a cold, wet place. Instead, you take it out to the sun. And here what we do is the Kohen locks the person, again, in the period of waiting to see how it's going to develop, the Kohen locks the person in a room for a week. Okay, so that's not consistent with what they would know about leprosy at the time. Also, why go to the priests? Go to the doctor. There are doctors in the Torah. Why the priest? Also, the fact that it can appear on garments and on homes, right? This is very unusual for the time. So this leads the traditional commentaries to say what we said, that it is an unusual occurrence. It was a form of a miracle. And how often it happened, it doesn't really matter. If you look at the entire Bible, they're outside the 4 books of, in other words, outside the 5 books of Moses, which is not a story of a leper. If you want to look at the entire Bible, there's only one more case. There's one more case in the Torah, which is Miriam. And there it comes in the context of Miriam speaking against Moses. And then you look at the entire Bible after that, in the stories of the Bible, if I'm not mistaken, there are only 4 stories. We read one of them yesterday with the Haftorah. So it's not a regular skin disease, then there would be many more cases and many more stories, right? We're saying the Torah here is giving all these laws, laying out the specific ritual, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's often in common. What it means is the Torah is telling you this concept that would lead to this is severe, and that's a serious issue. And that's the traditional perspective. I'm sure there are many other perspectives, but that's a traditional perspective. And hopefully the ideas that I mentioned as to this is a leprosy that can appear on garments, that can appear on a home. This was out of character. We don't think that the people thought common leprosy could appear on your home. Okay, go ahead, Vicky.
I had a question that related to Lashon Hara. So Lashon Hara is a very good explanation that it kind of, because you bring out something bad that exists in a person, that's why you have that skin disease that brings out on the surface something not so pretty. So what if the person speaks bad about person which does not exist, like saying lies about the person? The affliction is not that severe. Is there punishment for that?
So without getting into the details, Lashon Hara could be general evil talk. It could also mean something specific. I don't want to get too detailed here, but if you want to talk about the specific definition, Lashon Hara is evil talk is specifically something that is true. If it's not true, it's a different word. It's slander. And if it's slander, it's motzi shem ra, giving out a bad name, right? So there are different categories within the term of Lashon Hara. So in general, what they all have in common is they're breaking up the fabric of society. In other words, either so you're saying something that's true, or certainly if you're saying something that's untrue. Now, when we say that Sarat comes from Lashon Hara, do we mean something that is true or not true? That I'm not sure. That I have to go back and check.
But they're kind of in the same category, and we don't know whether this punishment is for truth or not.
I don't kind of recall offhand, but my guess, I wouldn't be surprised if we're using Lashon Hara now in the more general meaning, which is just evil speech in general.
Okay.
Okay, let's think about the speech for a moment. In the Torah takes speech very serious. And that's why we donate 2 portions to the idea of evil speech. And the first thing I said is a practical thing. It dissolves the fabric of society, but there's much more to that. Certainly once you start thinking about the Kabbalistic perspective, even before the Kabbalah, if you open up the first page of the Torah, God said that there was light. God said, let there be light, and there was light. How does God create the world? God creates the world through speech. Okay, so what does it mean? Speech, God doesn't have a mouth. That's another discussion. Speech means expression, but if you look at the Torah, you read the first chapter of Genesis, God creates the world through speech. So the Kabbalists say, just like God creates the world through speech, we also create our world through speech. In other words is what creates the environment that you live in. And words actually will shape the reality you live in. And Judaism has been saying this for thousands of years, but now they're doing all kinds of studies that confirm this. So for example, one study that I love is they tell people the doctor has to introduce a surgery. So the same surgery, the same statistics, but how it's presented would affect how likely the person is to accept it. So you come to a patient and you say, this procedure has 90% success rate. So that's option A. The option B is you come to the patient and you say, this procedure, there's 10% mortality rate. There's 10% chance that you're going to die. Okay? You told the exact same statistics as to the first patients. 90% success rates, 10% mortality rate. And yet they do the studies and they realize that if you frame it in the positive sense, if you say 90% success, people are much more likely to accept it. And this is a fascinating concept because speech, we think of speech, it doesn't really matter. The ideas matter. No, speech, according to Judaism, and Judaism reflects this, but this is a deep reality. Because God creates the world through speech, we are wired to be affected by speech, and it literally would create our environment, affect what's happening around us, affect how we make decisions, how we classify the events around us, and more importantly, how we think about ourselves and other people. And for certainly everybody knows that when you speak to, they do the studies about when they speak to children. And if you tell a child that they're a troublemaker, right, they're going to be a troublemaker. It's going to be self-fulfilling. On the other hand, if you tell the same troublemaker child, you have so much energy and so much potential, and it's amazing that you have all this creativity, and one day you're going to change the world with your creativity, that's what you're going to get. So whatever you speak is what you get. That's the environment you create through your speech. So if God creates the world with speech, we create our world with speech. So if I'm at home and I don't like the environment in my home, how do I change it? Well, I change it. I could buy new furniture. You could do that too. It's not going to really work in the long run. What I could do is change the way I speak. If I speak with kindness, if I speak with compassion, that's going to affect myself and the people around me. And that, again, that is why the Torah puts so much emphasis on the concept of the tzarat, because the idea of the power of speech, both to the negative and to the positive. Now, so far, it looks like the Torah is just getting negative, but we'll see later. If we have time, we'll get to the fact that within this parsha, within the second parsha, really, there's also allusions to the tremendous potential that a person has within the affliction of tzarat. So it's like something that can go either way. It can lead to negativity, it can also lead to positivity, and that's what speech is. And that's the power of speech, and that's why it is the Torah would spend so much time talking about the possibility of this skin disease, which probably was not very common. And it wasn't very common for other reasons as well, which Vicky alluded to yesterday. But from the Kabbalah talks about it. A lot of this would happen. Okay, let me give you the Kabbalistic perspective here. I'm just going to share the screen for a moment, and we'll see what's happening here. Adam. Okay. If a man has a seiter sapachat or baheret, that's the opening phrase. Adam, a man. So the first thing the Kabbalah will tell you is when you see the word man, you have to understand that in biblical Hebrew, there are 4 ways of saying the word man. There's 4 names for the word man. There is Adam, Ish, Enosh, Gever. I'm sorry, Adam, Ish, Gever, Enosh. And they have 4 different meanings. And it's because the human being has 4 general states of being, many more, but 4 general states of being. We'll start from the lowest, Enosh. Enosh comes from the words anush, which means weakness. Somebody's feeling weak. Someone is lacking. That's the lowest level. Above that is Gever. Gever is what they would call like a man, like macho. Gever. Gever comes from the word strong. So the lowest level is weak. Above that is strong. Strong means you're trying to become strong. You're working. Sometimes I'm weak and sometimes I have problems, but I am working. I have the inner energy and strength to overcome or to battle my challenges. Above that is Ish. Ish represents somebody who is emotionally healthy and stable. And Adam is the highest form of the man. And Adam means somebody who has that perspective, their intellectual capacity and their awareness is whole and complete. So all of those four names, if you look at the Bible, you will see that the different names are used in different contexts. When we name a person, here we're using the highest form of the human being, Adam. Adam, a man who will have on the skin of his flesh a disformation. So the Kabbalah says, in some sense, and this is to Jill's point, why this is so unusual. The Kabbalah says, who gets the tzarat? When does God interfere and show me, hey, Menachem, you have a problem. You gotta upgrade the way you're going to speak. When I am an Adam, when I'm on a very high level, and internally I am pretty much all clean and all positive. I just have some negativity, so it's going to come to the surface through the tzarat to help me diagnose it and help me correct it. So that's the Kabbalistic perspective. That's the perspective that, yes, we're talking about speech, but when you cannot expect a divine intervention to help you realize that you have to fix your speech unless you have everything else straightened out. In other words, if you're a bank robber, God's not interfering to help you with your speech. You have bigger problems. So that's just the Kabbalistic perspective on why we use the word Adam. But the lesson, the takeaway, is why we spend all these verses on this story. Is the takeaway to me, the most important takeaway is I have to be cognizant of the reality I am creating for myself, for my family, for any environment I'm in through speech. And everybody knows there's some people who they always spewing negativity. They're just saying bad things about other people and about always kvetching, like they say in Yiddish. Could be they're not bad people. It's just that that's the way they express. It's therapeutic for them. But it's therapeutic for them, but it's affecting you negatively because they're weighing down the environment. And there are other people spewing positivity, always saying nice things about people, always making you feeling good about yourself. Okay, that's the power of speech. I shouldn't say it now because it's too negative and it's being recorded. But I remember today, and I repeated it to somebody, there was a video, about this Chabad guy who makes video clips for the web. He tries to go viral, and he's sitting with a taxi driver, and the taxi driver turns to him and he says, oh, I shouldn't say this. This is so terrible. I don't know why I'm saying this. He says, people are garbage trucks. He says, what? What does it mean people are garbage trucks? He says, people are walking around, they have negativity. They're looking to dump it somewhere. Don't let them dump it on you. That was his message for the day. So what my point is that we have to be cognizant of, I come home and it's after a long day, I'm just letting out steam. Yeah, but I'm letting out steam. But what about the people around me? This is really affecting their reality, their universe, and how they understand the universe and how they feel about themselves. So this is to realize that the words have that immense power is really the takeaway of the parsha, even before we get into the actual parsha. This is all by way of introduction. So now we have 3 introductions, and like the gentleman used to say, before I start speaking, I'm going to say a few words. So that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing here today. So another interesting angle now is the angle of, I alluded to it before, the angle of who is the person that you bring, who do you call when you have this skin leprosy, this skin discoloration? So the verse says clearly you call the Kohen. So let's think about the Kohen for a minute. It's not like the Torah doesn't believe in doctors. It's not like the Torah says if you have a problem, if you break your leg, you should go to the priest. And you'd say, yeah, and some ancient tribes, whenever they have a problem, they go to the priest. No, that's not what the Torah says. In the second book of the Torah, when we talk about the laws of torts, the laws of damages, and if you damage somebody, it says, V'rapo yirapeh, you have to go pay for his medical bills. The word for is and the Talmud says this teaches that the doctor has permission to heal. So the Torah is very aware about not only aware, the Torah endorses the power of the medical field and the medical profession. And if you break your foot, you don't go to the priest. Or if you have any other ailment, you don't go to the priest, you go to the doctor. Here, you go to the priest. So that's very interesting. And now, what exactly is the role of the priest in this whole conversation? Because the problem here is that what you need to be able to determine whether or not somebody is, or whether or not this leprosy is considered impure or pure, you need to have a certain degree of expertise. There are many laws in the Torah and about this, and also to understand the shades of the colorings, you need a certain expertise. And not every priest had that expertise. And I'm now going to quote from Maimonides, the laws of Tzarat. And Maimonides describes what happens if the priest does not have the expertise. So Maimonides says, you know what happens? You bring a priest. He could be a kid. He could be 13 years old. He could be young. He could be immature. He doesn't even have to be smart. He can be mentally challenged. Then you bring the expert, and the expert examines the affliction. And then the expert turns to the priest and tells the priest, whispers in his ear, pronounce this pure or pronounce this impure. Now, what is this, a game? You're not relying on the wisdom of the priest, so why do you need the priest there? So let's read Maimonides. Jill, we'll take a question in a minute. I just want to read the Maimonides here. The designation of a person as impure or pure is dependent on a Kohen. What is implied? If there is a Kohen who does not know how to assess the blemishes, a sage should observe them and instruct him. Say you are impure, and the Kohen says you are impure. Say you are pure, and the Kohen says you are pure. Isolate him, and he isolates him. Even if a priest is a minor or intellectually or emotionally incapable, the sage instructs him and he declares the person definitively impure, releases him from the inspection process, or isolates him for further inspection. So in other words, there's a very interesting phenomenon. You bring the guy to the Kohen. The Kohen is important here, but why? We're not relying on the Kohen's expertise. There's something here deeper, other forms of impurity. Remember, you can't just read this portion in isolation and say, oh, in the ancient tribes, they always went to the priest. No, every other form of impurity, you don't go to the priest. There's no issue of bringing him to the priest. And here we keep going back and back to the priest. So that's the question. Jill, go ahead.
It just sounds like the beginning of psychiatry, or the origins of that profession in Jewish tradition. That the expert is not the guy who can read whether it's white or yellow or whatever the scab is, but the inner story.
Very good. Very good.
Okay, that's all.
Very good. So let's talk about this for a second. What is the priest? What does the priest represent? So what's the priest? So who are the priests? The priests are the descendants of Aaron, Moses' brother. What does Aaron represent? Aaron represents a man of peace and a man of love. Aaron represents love. And you look all throughout Jewish literature, the ethics of the fathers, be of the students of Aaron, a lover of the creations. Okay, we know Aaron is the first to be, you look at the book of Genesis and you see how brothers behave with each other sometimes, and brothers kill each other, and brothers have to run away from each other, and brothers sell each other into slavery. That's the pattern of the book of Genesis until you get to Joseph's two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, who get along. And then you get to the epitome of Aaron and Moses. And who's Moses? Who's Aaron? Somebody who not only is not jealous of his younger brother who becomes the leader, not only he doesn't kill him, not only he doesn't sell him as a slave, but the verse says God tells Moshe doesn't want to take the job of leading the people because he's afraid he's going to make his brother jealous. And God tells him, go meet Aaron. Aaron will see you and he'll be happy for you in his heart. So in other words, Aaron represents love. And in fact, even till today, when the priests, today we don't have the temple. So the priests don't lead in many rituals the way they used to. But there is still a mitzvah that the priests have to bless the people. And if you go to Israel, the priests bless the people every Shabbat in the synagogue. If you go to Jerusalem, they bless the people every day. But outside of Israel, the ceremony of Birchat Kohanim, a blessing, the priestly blessing, only occurs on special occasions when people are happy anyway, and that is the high holidays and the Rosh Hashanah and the high holidays and the three biblical festivals. Now, when you read the priests, before they bless the people, they make a blessing. They say, "Blessed are you, Lord, King of the universe, who commanded us to bless his people, Israel, with love." That's critical. And the Talmud said, the Zohar says that a priest who doesn't love the people, it's dangerous for him to bless the people. So if you're sitting in a shul with 1,000 members and there's one guy in the back who you don't like, and you're the priest, says the Zohar, you're not allowed to make the blessing. Because to be the priest to bless the people, you have to, it's not just verbally, you have to fill your heart with love. So we see here, because otherwise the blessing doesn't work. So we see here that the priest represents love. And what's happening here is that, this is the Rebbe's teaching, the Rebbe says, in some sense, you have to pronounce this guy, atzarat, in some sense it's the worst form of impurity, because you're sending him outside of the community. In other words, you have to, and sometimes you're being very critical of this person, and you're saying that based on the signs of his skin, this is very severe. So the real question here becomes, who are you going to get to give the bad news? Who are you, in modern simple English, who can criticize effectively, right? So nobody likes to hear critique because we don't like it. It's bad for our ego. But obviously, the greatest gift is when somebody could tell you and help you grow and critique you and say, you know something, I think you have to improve. And if it's done effectively, it could be helpful. If it's done in the wrong way, it's not going to work, and a person we're just going to become defensive. Because if I come to you and I say all your problems, you're just going to become defensive. So if you Google how to critique effectively, they're going to say all kinds of interesting things of how to critique effectively. And some of them are alluded to in this parsha, which we may get to in a minute. But the most important thing that the Torah is telling you is make sure when you're critiquing somebody, it could be your spouse, it could be your child, it could be your colleague, it doesn't matter who it is. Make sure that it's coming from the Kohen within you. Who's the Kohen within you? The Kohen represents the love. If I'm telling my child, you know, you have to improve in this area, unless I'm feeling love at this moment, I'm not the Kohen. And the Kohen is the one who has to declare something negative. So it's not enough to say, look, I analyze this. I know objectively my child has a problem. I need to tell them that to them. That's wonderful. That's the Chacham, that's the sage. So for the evaluation, you go for the sage. But for the pronunciation, to say pure or impure, the child, the other person, the person being critiqued must know that's coming from a priest, it's coming from a man of love, for a person of love, from a place of love. And it's both, that if I love you, only when I feel the love, of course I love my children, I don't always feel the love, confession, alert, okay, delete that from the recording. You don't always feel the love for your children. But when you're going to critique it, you have, at that point, you have to make sure you feel it, because if you don't feel it, it may not be the right time to do it. And from the other angle, it's also true from the angle of the person saying the critique. It's also true from the person receiving it. The person receiving it is not going to receive it unless the person feels that it comes from a place of love. Otherwise, the person becomes defensive. So that's why we keep saying, maybe he'll be brought to the Kohen comes, the Kohen sees. And again, I'm saying that it's not just, it's out of character. We don't find this idea of the Kohen's involvement in the other forms of impurity, declaring something pure or impure. We don't say, oh, I wasn't sure if I touch a dead body. Let me go to the priest. No, you go to the sage. You have a question, you go to the sage. What's the priest here? Here, to pronounce someone and say, you're so impure that you have to be separated from the camp. Okay? You have to make sure that it's that the person pronouncing it is a man of love, and therefore the person listening to the person being critiqued will be inspired to change, because he knows that the criticism comes from a place of love. This is before all the techniques of how to do it and how to say it, which is very important. And I'm just going to say one of them, but you can Google and find lists, how to critique effectively. One website will tell you these are the top 7 ways. The other one will tell you the top 15 ways. The other one will top 6 ways. These are all techniques. Techniques are important. But before the technique, you have to make sure that you're the Kohen, you're feeling the love. You also have to make sure that the person hearing it senses that you're a Kohen, that it's coming from a place of love. So that's the general attitude. Now, I was curious, so I did Google how to criticize effectively. And they have all interesting things. But basically, one of the things they say is make sure you don't critique the person, you critique the action. Don't say you're a terrible person. You always, you're so disorganized, you always leave your laundry on the floor, even though it's true. You have to say, you have to focus on the action. You have to say, not you're a terrible person, not you're disorganized. Say, this action has to be corrected. You have to put your clothing in the hamper. Fine. Focus on the action, don't focus on the person. When I saw that, I look back at the Parsha and I say, maybe this is what the Torah is telling us. In addition to the idea of the priest, which is the general idea of the attitude. I mentioned this verse earlier. A man has a se'et sapachat of on the skin of his flesh. What does that mean? It means we're telling you, and this actually, I'm sorry, this is not my idea. This is the idea from the Orach Chaim, one of the great Torah commentaries in the 18th century. He says as follows. He says, what is the Torah really telling us? That a person, the impurity of a person is on the surface level. Internally, a person is whole and complete and positive. The fact that there's impurity within the person, and it's a severe impurity, and that's why that impurity is going to get him outside the camp. And you have to separate from other people because this is so severe. So we're not whitewashing. We're not painting everything with a pink brush. But on the other hand, what we're saying is, even when a person sins, it's not only in his flesh, it's on the surface of the skin of the flesh. Meaning it's completely external. This is not who you are. It's just something that you did, something that clung to you, but it's external. It doesn't define you. So when I read the different techniques of how to critique, they seem to be saying critique the action, not the person. I think that's what the Orach Chaim says. That's exactly what the Torah is alluding to in verse 2, where the affliction is only in the skin of the flesh. And then, like I said, the general idea is, if you want your critique to be effective, first of all, you have no right to critique unless you're a Kohen, unless you are feeling the love at the time. In addition, that's probably the best way for that person to be able to feel and feel that for the person to accept the critique and hopefully not reject it and not become defensive, but try to correct it. That will only come if he feels that you are a Kohen, you're speaking out of a place of love. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is, I say we're scratching the surface. I don't even think we began to scratch the surface on these parshas, but this is a good introduction. So all this was by way of introduction, and hopefully God will give us long life. We'll be able to continue studying the Torah in good health. And who knows, maybe even in person. No, God willing, in person sooner rather than later. So have a wonderful day, and don't forget that the world you want is the world you can create through your speech, and that's probably the most important takeaway, at least for myself. I'm speaking for myself. I'm speaking to myself, and I'm speaking to myself. Everyone else, I'm more than happy for you to listen, but I'm really talking to myself. It's just talking to myself is strange. So I say, you know what? Let's talk to everybody, but really, I need to hear this. And so thank you for joining.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You